So then in those moments where I'm making signs for some game, I can talk to people and find out their interests. And the more we're in high interest activities too, the more I'm finding my people, because my people share those interests, and therefore I don't have to fake it because I'm with people who have similar interests. And so I think it's really important to kind of come from that perspective too, of like, my whole goal is to get to know people.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking about all things friendship related, exploring why some of our kids find it harder to make and keep friends, how we can identify where they need support, and most importantly, what we can actually do to help them, with our expert guest, Caroline Maguire. Caroline is an award-winning author, coach, teacher, and keynote speaker whose work has inspired important conversations about social skills, friendship, and belonging. Caroline has been a rock for thousands of neurodivergent people who struggle to make friends. Her unique way of drawing out the best in her clients has been recognised internationally. She speaks at conferences, organisations, and institutions around the world, and literally wrote the book on it. Why Will No One Play With Me has won several awards, including the Best Book Award from American Book Fest, Mum's Choice Award for Honouring Excellence, and the Book Authority's Award for Best ADHD Books of All Time. Her next book, Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults, will be out in April 2026. Caroline also hosts the ADHD Social Playbook podcast and has ADHD herself. Welcome aboard, Caroline.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So I think that one of the hardest parts of raising a child with ADHD can be watching them struggle socially. And I think it's something that most of our children will go through at some point. And so in order to understand why this happens, I think we need to understand our ADHD brains. And I'd like to begin by asking you about that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So let's start with, what is executive function?
So executive function is the root of everything we do, and it's an umbrella term. So it's not one part of the brain. Executive function is all of the different parts of the brain coming together to perform things like organization, future thinking, self-monitoring, which you need for socialization, right? What am I doing? What's my impact? And things like self-regulation, emotional regulation, attention, right? I don't know if we would call it attention deficit disorder today, but attention does play in and is an executive function. And all of these different executive functions help us be more aware of what's going on. It allows us to, work toward goals, think about what we want to do socially, allow us to monitor ourselves and respond to people and, manage our emotions as we respond to people and use our future thinking, except in executive functions case, with kids with ADHD, our executive function is very weak in some cases. And it's a spectrum. So your executive function can be strong in one area and weak in another. So that's why some ADHD kids, they can have great social skills and they can be very, good at making friends, and maybe they're disorganized, right? Because it's a spectrum. Or they can really be great in another area of executive function, but struggle socially. And everything we do socially, it really comes down to executive function, because even when you have a conversation, there's organization involved, there's attention involved, there's self-regulation involved. And what happens with ADHD is that our executive function is weaker and delayed. And so it really, really, really impacts behavior. It's really the root of a lot of our challenges. And so when we think about our kids, their executive function is usually the reason that they struggle socially. It's behind everything. But the good news is that these executive functions can be developed and they can be strengthened, and we can teach skills that allow our kids to make those kind of friends and connections.
Thank you. That is super comprehensive introduction to all of this. And I think we'll dig deeper into this, particularly in the way that we see those struggles manifest and what we can do about it. But I just wanted to begin by picking up on what you were saying about those executive function weaknesses, in particular those delays, and just to find out a bit more about why our children with ADHD have executive function delays.
So there have been longitudinal studies that have showed that children with ADHD are about 3 to 5 years delayed in terms of maturity. And so what that means is you're not talking to a 14-year-old in terms of their executive function, in terms of their development, in terms of their perspective, right? They are more like, a 10-year-old. So one of the things that happens is think about a 10-year-old's humor versus a 14-year-old's humor, right? Think about the things your 10-year-old can handle versus a 14-year-old. And what happens is what we found in the brain is that we have these delays. And these delays mean that our kids are really developmentally behind. And it's stage, not age, right? So in child development, we look at what stage is the child at? Because it's always a window, right? It's always a window. They say, your baby will walk by age 1. It's not. It's 1 to 2, right? There's this developmental window. And so when we know that our ADHD kids are 3 to 5 years behind, in some cases, right, there are super mature ADHD kids. What happens is all of these executive function weaknesses become very apparent. They have a lot of struggles in terms of relating to their peers, right? Because their humor is immature, because their skills are immature. Because a 14-year-old with ADHD may not be able to keep up with people and text them and may not even see the need, right? They are maybe having that younger perspective where they're like, people will call me, right? And a lot of the struggles also that we have as littler kids, they carry with us. They become like the ghost of Christmas past. And so as we move forward, other kids are remembering those things. And it is totally overcomeable, but it is something that I think that lag means that, sometimes our kids don't even really want friends at the age when other kids who are typical want friends. Their whole perspective is more immature. So it does really matter. We don't leave them where they are, though. We can help them lift their skills and move forward and adjust their perspective and grow, because those executive functions may not grow on their own. When you're 30, you might still have very, very weak executive functions, which impacts everything.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And really does begin to explain where those struggles come from. I'm just wondering, in some of the examples you gave there, what role environment might play in that. So as you said, obviously the executive function skills themselves are on a spectrum, and you might have one ADHD child who's actually quite mature and able to manage these things versus someone who is experiencing much more of that delay. But within that, is there also the case that environment plays a part? So where you might have a child that perhaps is able to manage some of these executive functions and therefore the social skills necessary in one situation, but may then struggle in another?
Absolutely. So, first, let me just say to parents, if they could do it, they would do it. So it has nothing to do with you and your parenting, right? A lot of us with ADHD who are parenting, we very much worry about what we're modeling. We worry about our impact. I think we have also the benefits of, I am ADHD and therefore I understand what it's like to be an ADHD person, which I think is a huge advantage because, am I perfect? No, I just realized that karate is at 4:45 today, not 6. So, the whole afternoon's a little messed up because of that. It's back to school. It's a little crazy. But I also think we have the advantage of understanding and empathy. So don't, beat yourself up, parents. But I think there's also this factor that if environment models executive function and gives kids those life skills from an early age, some of these gaps might not show up as much, except there's this thing called free will. And the problem with kids with ADHD that we face is something might be really important to you, right? And I hear this from parents all the time. They're like, I worry they're not going to be a good roommate. I worry they're not going to be a good partner. And the kid is 10 years old and they don't care. They're not there yet. They're not like, I'm not going to be a great partner. This is going to affect the workplace. So I think one thing we have to remember is you might be a great model. Your environment might be set up to do everything. I know speech pathologists who do this for a living, and their kids are like, nah, my parents don't know anything, So I think what we have to realize is environment does impact them. If they're not seeing models of executive function, if they're not able to sort of have an environment that supports their ADHD brain, I think that will definitely affect them. That doesn't mean that today you can't, as a parent, pivot and implement different strategies. And the biggest thing, I think, is that every kid with ADHD needs different things. And what we have to do as parents is really learn a ton about our kids' brain, teach them about their brain, and then support them in whatever unique way they need, right? And I think that that's the hard part, is that you get a lot of advice and you try things and they don't always work for your kid. That's not a you problem. It just doesn't work for me. That's why I always say, don't say, oh, you have to use this one planner, because that planner might not work for me. There's a gajillion planners. Collaborate with your kid. And that's the biggest thing. Whatever you do going forward, think about, how do I collaborate with my kid? Not collaborate, so that I'm their partner. They know I'm receiving them without judgment. We fix whatever snafu, and we're able to create and curate the environment they need, because the environment has a tremendous impact on us.
And obviously some environments we can't necessarily curate exactly how we might like them. Like I'm thinking about the classroom, and I'll come back to that in a minute if that's okay. But
yes.
Just before that, I wanted to ask a little bit about you. Obviously you talked then about how, one child with ADHD is one child with ADHD. We're all going to present really differently. So for those children that maybe struggle more with things like anxiety, overthinking and rejection, I just wonder how those elements can sort of further affect children socially.
Yeah, they say that children with ADHD receive 20,000 negative comments by age 12 or something. And I think that we can't control every environment they're in. I am a huge believer in, if the coach in the next town is more neuroaffirming and better for ADHD kids, drive to the next town. Don't put them in an environment where they're going to be criticized all the time. Sometimes you don't know, but if you have to, lift them out of that. I'm a big believer in that. But I think there's a lot of criticism they receive. And I think when we are thinking about anxious kids who, feel things so deeply and have a lot of sensory issues, that is going to affect the environment they need. We can't always curate it, sadly, but at home you can. And, the key to resilience with kids, they know this from research, I know this from watching them, is that one caring adult is there for them, and that they know, I might not have the skills, but I can rely on this adult. And so I think that's key too. Do they know that you're going to be there? You're going to help them. You can figure out strategies, and that they can turn to you. Because I think with anxious kids, a lot of times there's a lot more known about co-regulation and helping them to calm their limbic system. And there's this thing called polyvagal theory. And just in a nutshell, it's basically that. And it's like my grandmother would say, no kidding, right? We all know this, right? But it's more new research in the past 25 years. It's like my limbic system and my nervous system affects your nervous system. So the best thing you can do for anxious kids with sensory issues, etc., is really that you calm yourself and you provide that body double, that helper to calm them. Because what happens a lot of times in the home is my anxiety affects your anxiety. And, as kids, they don't always say my anxiety levels are going up. they don't always have those words. So I think that's a key factor, and we can be that for them, even if we can't affect the school and the day that they have.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that statistic there about the 20,000 negative messages. And I'm so with you, because I think helping a child build a positive sense of self and really, really give them a sense of self-esteem to live up to, because often in a classroom environment, for those that might struggle academically, they can feel like these negative messages are really chipping away at them. And I'm wondering then, from a social perspective, if we think about the context of that school environment, which is something that we can't necessarily curate completely in the way that we would like it. If a child is struggling in that context and perhaps their reputation ends up negatively affected because of the classroom, or indeed their sense of self, how does that then add as a sort of further impact to these struggles?
I think it adds a lot. Look, everything we do socially, we need confidence for. Everything we want to do socially, we need confidence for. If I am going to, ask someone to hang out, I have to have the confidence for that. So I think we should really focus on our kids' strengths. I always recommend that people help kids with their self-talk so that they're speaking less negatively about themselves. I think it's really important that they do something every single day that they are good at, right? So maybe the school day isn't their thing, but then they have something that they go to football after school and they love it and they're good at it. And I think it's really important also because that builds them up. And then some of the negative comments, maybe they don't take in. It also affects how other peers see them. And I also really like my clients to catalog their wins. So, we tend to go to the negative. Our brain remembers negative comments more than it remembers positives. And a win could literally be, I showed up here. Like, a win does not have to be like I, climbed Mount Everest. So I think it's really, really important. And I think the negativity that they experience, it not only makes other kids, maybe more likely to pick on them, but I think the biggest thing it does is kills their confidence. Because I think there's certainly plenty of kids who the teacher criticizes and it doesn't affect them because they don't care about academics or they don't take it in. But I think what happens to our kiddos is that they do take it in and then they feel smaller and they start to try to make themselves smaller. And I think strengths make yourself bigger. And I talked a lot about this on my podcast, the ADHD Social Playbook, with one of the people that isn't as much in the ADHD space, but I want to bring her in more, Dr. Kate Truitt, where she talked a lot about how we can calm our anxiety and overcome rumination and negativity. And it is something that I think, we get caught in that spiral and we feel really bad about ourselves. And there are ways to break it. You can do a pattern interrupt, you can exercise, you can shift your environment. And when I look back at my life as an ADDer, I've been ruminating since I was like 5 years old. Like I didn't know the word till I was like 30, but I used to call it fretting. I used to say that I fretted all the time. And I knew that I would just be in that cycle. And so I also want to say to parents, if someone says to me, somebody just wrote me an email the other day and they said, well, we're waiting till age 7 to get our child an anxiety diagnosis because we assume you can't get one. And I was like, no, that's not true. So if your child is, age 5, age 6, age 7, suffering like this, we definitely can get them help.
I'm so glad that you talked there about the strengths to start with, about giving our children an environment, if they're perhaps struggling in one, putting them in a different space that allows them to build that self-esteem. I think right back to when my son was much younger and he had his ADHD diagnosis at 6.5. He's 14 now. And I knew nothing about ADHD, like at the beginning, nothing at all, especially compared to what I know now. And I really followed my kind of gut and instinct on that I wanted to be led by his interests and sort of follow him into finding spaces where he could exist outside of a classroom, outside of school, and that he could do something that he was good at and that he felt good about himself. And also then, therefore, connected to others socially in a different context with a different reputation. And I do think that is just so important. So thank you for making that point, because I think that our children are at school, but it is only one environment, and there are other environments that come into play, and that we can play a really active role in helping shape those and create places in which our children can feel good about themselves. Like you said, that sense of successes and wins and ways in which that we can build ourselves up, because I think there's such an important foundation for developing some of these skills to help them then move forward in the areas that they're really struggling with. Like you talked then about anxiety and rumination, because I think that will relate to so many people listening. I mean, I know that would have been me. I couldn't have had a word for it exactly as you said, but even now I'm learning this stuff about myself. But on the subject, as we start to kind of dig into now what we can do about some of this stuff, and we think about some of the skills that you started to touch on there, I feel like this is probably a really important point to start by looking at what the distinction is between learning and developing social skills and masking, and why that's important. I just sort of add to that because I see this as something that can be quite a hot topic, and something that people talk about quite often in my own community. And I just wanted to, before we go into some of this in more detail, really just begin by saying why we want to help our children in this context and what the key difference there is.
I think the biggest key difference is I don't want you to suppress your neurodivergent traits. Like STEM, fidget, I do, right? People are going to watch this and they're going to be like, she fidgets all the time. I do. I adjust myself, I move around in my chair. I literally have had to, pick a mic that doesn't mind that I move around so much. I think that masking is really about suppressing those ADHD traits to please other people. And I think the difference is I want to teach kids skills so that they have choice. So I'm not asking you to suppress anything about yourself. I'm more saying there's a skill gap. And many ADHD kids don't know how to make conversation. They don't know how to play other than parallel play. They don't know how to, figure out like, what could we do together, right? Like they struggle with these things. They struggle with self-regulation, which makes them, not say things they mean, right? Like saying the wrong thing at the wrong time isn't about pleasing people and masking. To me, it's about, I really didn't mean it that way. And I blurted it out. And now like people think I have one perspective and that's not what I mean. And so to me, it's about, I help them read the room and then they make a choice, right? Mm-hmm. And that choice might be, go ahead and say it anyway, right? That happens. But it's also about, you have to have skills to connect and show someone your authentic self, right? And to me, your authentic self is your humor, your traits, your quirks, your perspective, what makes you feel like something's fun, your strengths. But I feel like one of the big gaps in the masking discussion is, but you have to have skills to connect with people. And a lot of my clients, they just don't really get the social game, and they don't really have the skills they don't have the conversation skills to connect. And they're also so anxious, and they take everything as I've done something wrong when really they haven't. So I think that's really the biggest difference to me between masking. I don't want you to do things as someone else. I want you to do it from your own personality.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to describe it. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you're saying there. I'm sat on a wobble stool for the fidgeting reason. I know that no one can see me, but you can, because I need to move. And I also think on that point that you made just then, we want to find our people, right? So yes. To find our people, we have to be authentic, but we also need to know how to do that, and how to find those people where we can be wholeheartedly not just accepted, but like celebrated and valued for who we are. So from a skills perspective then, like what skills are necessary for children with ADHD to build friendships?
I think one of the biggest skills that's necessary is conversation skills, right? We don't love chit chat, but chit chat is actually something that is really helpful because it allows you to get to know people and feel them out. And especially for teenagers, you don't want to be friends with everyone. I know kids who don't have friends are going to say, I want to be friends with anyone. No, you don't. Because some kids don't value you, don't treat you well, don't have the same thoughts and feelings about stuff that you do. So I think conversation is a big one. understanding like how to keep up with people, engage with people, make next steps with them is not something most ADHD kids that I encounter know. There's a lot of research that shows that ADHD kids struggle with perspective taking, that's one of the biggest reasons they have trouble with friendship. And so by that, I mean thinking about how something will be received, thinking about who someone is, thinking about what's going on in their life, right? Like, think about your, sort of teen kids, college age kids. Like, people forgive a lot, but if they're telling you something really big and impactful, if you switch the conversation to be about you, and I know that's a very neurodivergent trait. We love to share our story to relate to someone. But people don't understand that. So I have solutions for that. Like, you frame it up and you say, hey, I'm going to do that ADHD thing where I'm going to tell you a story. And that story seems to be about me, but I'm going to bring it back around. It relates to you. And then people are like, great, cool, fine. But all those nuanced things, they say like teenage friendships move so fast and the dynamics are so fast. I don't know if I 100% agree with that. I think part of it is that people have skills and our kids don't have the skills. And so that's what people attribute to like, oh, the dynamics are so complicated. I think the dynamics are kind of just more, you have to explain stuff to people. And when you relate to them, you have to make sure that they feel seen and heard. And so all those skills are not things that ADHD kids often have. And then another big one is, do you show up, right? So there's self-regulation. There's a stereotypical ADHD kid who's dysregulated and says the wrong thing and kind of becomes dysregulated and maybe gets too angry or too excited, right? There's also another factor that I see a ton, which is kids that are invisible. They don't talk to anyone else. They don't engage with people. They don't mix into a group. And those are skills. And introverts have friends, My mom is an introvert. My mom has tons of friends. She has way more friends than I do because she's a great listener and she keeps up with people because she's typical. Like, she has all these things she does. So being an introvert doesn't mean you don't have friends. But if you disappear, which a lot of folks with ADHD do, and you don't show up to stuff and you don't attend stuff and you don't keep up with people, then that's a big friendship skill. And I think all these things are skills you can build, and you can build them in your own way, right? You're not going to look like everyone else. You're going to do it your way. And one of the biggest things I think is to explain yourself to people. Like, here's who I am. I struggle to keep up with people. So like, can we make this something that's a regular thing and I don't have to remember, Mm-hmm. I think that's a piece that's often a skill gap that people don't do. And therefore people are like, you disappeared for 4 months. What happened?
Yeah, I think you started off there by summarizing that so well about the conversation skills and everything that falls out or flows, probably a better word, from there. And it made me think about a conversation I was having yesterday with a teenage boy, and he was talking about it in the context of how you begin a conversation with someone when, these weren't his words, but I'll frame it in this particular way, when my interests are quite narrow and I don't know anything about the things that they're interested in. So how do you even begin to have that conversation? So we were exploring together about learning to be kind of curious and interested in other people, that you don't have to know these things. You don't have to know the answer to be able to have like an interesting conversation, or to even begin that conversation to begin with. So why is it important then for our children to learn and understand, to be able to kind of read what's going on in social situations so that they can then begin that conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a core element here, which is how we make friends. Like, the formula for friendship that I'm going to have in my next book, Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults, is you go to high interest activities, right? You described it so well. Places where he can be himself, where he feels accepted, where he feels good, which have high engagement, right? So they have to have an element of, we get to talk to each other, right? So yearbook, school newspaper, some sports teams. My daughter's a swimmer. There's tons of time where they sit in the bullpen and play cards and talk to each other. But there's other sports where you don't. You're just parallel to each other. It's not that those are bad sports, but there's not activities where they can get to know each other. There's sports where they make signs on a Friday night together before the big meet or the big game the next day. That's great because you're getting to be with other kids. So if you think about conversation, right, and the skills you need and the things you need to build, in those moments of opportunity, you need to be able to talk to other people, right? And you need to be able to explore what someone's interests are. And you need to be able to sort of add to that conversation, like say things, and be curious, which we are so curious. So we actually are like completely set up for this, right? It's just, I think sometimes I almost feel like sometimes I have to sort of point everything out to a kid and show them how they have the strengths for this and how their curiosity can come in for them to sort of figure out what it looks like. And so I do also a ton of conversation practice. And a lot of this is in Why Will No One Play With Me, and it's on my website and it's there for you in YouTube videos and stuff. If you're a parent, you're like, how do I do this? But I do a lot of conversation practice because it's like, once you feel better about it too, you're like, oh, I am so curious. We are such curious people. I want to know everything, right? So then in those moments where I'm making signs for some game, I can talk to people and find out their interests. And the more we're in high interest activities too, the more I'm finding my people, because my people share those interests. And therefore I don't have to fake it because I'm with people who have similar interests. And so I think it's really important to kind of come from that perspective too, of like, my whole goal is to get to know people, right? I think when we think about conversation, people are like, it's so boring. I hate it, whatever. People DM me, I hate conversation. Stop talking about it. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. It's a part of life. But it's like we see it that way. But I would like love to reframe it as it can be boring, but like, you're a detective. You're trying to find out about people and if they share your interests. And so that's like the whole purpose of conversation. It's not to talk about the weather and be bored.
Do you know, when you said there about a detective, I thought my next question was, where do we start? What are the steps to developing these skills? Because as you said, it's about getting to know people. So if you're listening and you're thinking about your child, or actually even if you're a young adult yourself and you're thinking about this in relation to yourself, like, how do we begin that process of developing these conversation skills? Like, how do we take the first step?
I think there's a couple steps to conversation. One is conversation starters, right? How was your summer? What did you do on holiday? Where did you go to school before this? Those kind of questions. And I think then there's this thing where with each piece of conversation, you're building and you're adding to things. And so there's the practice of when someone says something, asking them a question or adding to the conversation. And I think that whenever it's a topic we love, we probably do this more naturally. But I would practice that with kids. And you can literally take Jenga or blocks. And I do this with adults too, so it's not too childish. It's a thing that we need to do. And every time they add to the conversation, they add a block to build a tower. Because even if they pause, even if they turn to you and say, I don't know what to say, it's like, okay, let's think about what to say, right? Be curious, ask them a question, add a thought to this, right? But I think the other piece of where do you start is being curious and practicing that as a family at dinner, right? Having conversations at dinner, grandparents are like the single greatest thing for this, by the way. Call your grandparents and say, I need help with this. My kid needs help practicing conversation, and have them. Yeah, I know it's older people. They're not the same generation, but a lot of it is the fluidity of what do I do next? And that's a way that we can sort of, ask the other members of our family to help us. And, a lot of the luck I've had is where kids get more comfortable at home having conversations and making it, more fluid. And then I'm like, okay, now let's pivot a little bit and make it more teen talk, and let's talk to teenagers. But a lot of times I feel like they get caught up and they don't know, what do I do next? So practicing that. And again, I have a lot of stuff like about this in While No Play With Me. But I think the other piece too, just to add, is when they're trying to get to know someone, I have a skill in my new book called dropping a ping, where you just, like a submarine drops something into the ocean, you just say like, okay, let me tell them that I love Marvel or I love football, and see what they say, right? And if they say nothing, then you're like, okay, I guess they're maybe not my people because they don't love this thing that I want to spend every minute of every day doing. But if you say, I love football, and they're like, oh, I love it too, this is my team, now you've clicked. So whenever kids are trying to start conversation, I would help them to have a few statements that they just pepper into the conversation, because then we're feeling people out. Are you my people? Do you like the things I like?
And I guess we don't have to like all of the same things, do we? So what's kind of nice about that technique is if you've got some of those pings like pre-prepared, that they might not like football, but that's okay because we've still got other things that we might be able to find as common ground. And I like the example you gave of grandparents too, because you touched on this earlier on about perspective taking. And that's really where that conversation began yesterday for me, was around interest. Like if you don't know anything about that person's interest, like how do you then get curious? How do you begin that conversation? And grandparents are probably a great way of doing that, because it's not even your generation. They're not doing the same things as you. Their time is spent doing other things, perhaps in a way that sometimes can be hard to relate to. So that's probably a really, really great place to be practicing these things in quite an authentic way, because it's almost not even role playing then, is it? You're actually learning to, how do I build the conversation, to use your brilliant Jenga example, because it's such a visual. I'm like, how do I add the next block to this? Like, where can I take this? What pin can I drop? What question can I ask? And how do I, just keep practicing it, I guess.
And I think there's something about the ping method that I love, because it's like, I'm not going to rule you out as a friend, right? Because, think about all of your interests. I probably have 10 different things that, are interests of mine that I would be pinging for, right? But it also is a way to create sort of an instant connection. I have a little story. So this summer, my daughter did a program in England and she loved it and it was great, except she missed ice, because ice isn't as much a part of British culture, right? And, my big goal for her wasn't the academics. My big goal was that she learn how to be away from home, how to make friends, all that stuff. And I'm texting her and I'm FaceTiming her, and she said to me, Mom, I was fine. I bonded over a bunch of girls because we all miss ice. And just one day at lunch, I said, I miss ice. And then everybody started talking about how much they missed ice. So it's like, it doesn't have to be so brilliant, right? Like a lot of our kids perseverate and they ruminate and they're worried about every word that comes out of their mouth. And that's why I want them to practice with you. Because the more you practice, the more you're like, I've had 10 conversations and 3 of them fell apart and I recovered, right? But also, saying stuff and thinking about your pings, like, what is it that is on your mind? What is it that's in pop culture that kids are paying attention to? And just saying something about it and seeing if anybody bites, if anybody sort of, says, oh, I'm interested in that too. And it's a really simple thing. I like, have 3 conversation starters, have a couple pings in your back pocket so that when you're nervous, you can sort of, it's almost like riding a bike. You can go back to that muscle memory and go, okay, I know how to do this. And that's why I think practice is so important too, because, the reason that we can go back to that muscle memory with riding a bike is that we've ridden the bike. And I can go back to it. I even had that riding horses. Like I haven't ridden a horse in years. And I rode a horse like a few weeks ago and I was like, oh, it comes back, like all that stuff comes back. And, if you think about it, if you have practiced conversation, then when you get really nervous, hopefully like, okay, I did this with my grand, we got through it, I pivoted, I know I can. And then like that muscle memory will come back and you will like be able to recover. And I think that's important because I think kids have so much fear and I don't want them to. I want them to know like the worst case that can happen is that the conversation kind of falls apart. And like this is a recoverable thing.
And that happens, right?
And it happens to adults
all the time. I was smiling with the ice example that you were giving there.
And I'm not running down anyone British. I love England, as you know. And I didn't even think of it, but it was just such a funny thing. I was like, ice isn't as much of a thing, especially in the countryside, you know?
Yeah, I'm so with you. Honestly, I had this exact conversation last week with somebody because I love ice. Like I would have my Coke overflowing with ice. That's perfect to me, but it's definitely not as big a thing here as I have discovered. So I would bond with your daughter over that conversation. That would be our ping. I'd send it right back. It would work. But you're so right that you do need to recover from these things, and that can be difficult. Like if you've dropped the ping, you get nothing back. It's hard as adults, but that's where the practice comes in. And I guess that's why it takes time to see these changes. I just wondered if you could talk us through that a little bit more, like the need to kind of focus on one thing at a time to really build that consistency, and why it isn't necessarily going to happen quickly.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to know that these things take practice. And I love to help kids be in a more practice mindset where I'm like, you're going to mess up, right? Like everyone messes up, and that they are learning. And even when you mess up, there's this opportunity to learn, and we're in the learning zone. And to say to themselves, I'm practicing. Like this isn't going to be perfect. I'm in the practice mode. And I try to, help them see that this is just like any skill you're practicing. You're working on it. And I think, again, the more they practice and see it as learning a skill, the less they're expecting things to just like always go smoothly, be perfect, etc. But I think it's also really important that we celebrate things they do well and, point them out. And we're all busy. I totally get it. We all miss certain things, but just if you can sort of have your radar up for, that was great. And what a good question you asked. And, in the family, in your daily life, as you're trekking them from activity to activity, whatever you see that they're doing well, so that they see the results of their practice, because it's hard sometimes.
It is. And I'm thinking as well as, beyond younger children, where we might be facilitating this a lot more into children and young adults. You mentioned something earlier on, and I smiled because I know that I definitely do this, where you want to relate to someone. So you're straight in with it, like, oh my God, me too. And you're not trying to make it about you. You are trying to show that you're connecting to them and that you can relate to them in some way. And perhaps that's your way of building on that conversation. But when we're thinking about developing these skills, particularly as we're getting older, becoming young adults, how can explaining, because you mentioned this and we didn't really dig into it, and I thought that's probably a good point to pick back up on that. How can really framing, I guess, your brain, if you want to put it across that way, or if not, just explaining what's happening for you in that moment actually help you, and why is that important? So
there's a lot of studies. So I had this belief, and then I wanted to put it in the book. So then I did a lot of research because I was like, is this just a Caroline belief? And there's actually a lot of studies, especially since 2020. So they're like new groundbreaking studies that show that one of the big problems between, ADHD, autistic kids and typical kids is miscommunication, is that if you don't explain, they don't understand. But that if you explain, people are like, great, cool, and they're fine with it. And that really it's not the traits that alienate us. The belief has always been, and this is what led to masking. You have to mask these neurodivergent traits. You have to mask these ADHD traits. It's the traits that drive people crazy. You have to be self-regulated. You can't stim. You can't whatever. These new studies are really countering that. And I'm glad, because that is not my experience. My experience is it's bafflement, right? So one thing that ADHD kids with autism and ADHD do a lot is that they like share their special interests and they info dump. They are trying to relate to people and they're sharing something that's really important to them, right? So what I do is I teach these kids to still info dump, but say to people, hey, is it okay if I share something with you? Or that reminds me of something. Or I love to share this stuff, and it's my way of like getting excited about something and showing you that I'm interested in what you're saying. And the reaction universally is usually like, okay, and I think, if we just talk at people and monologue at them all the time, they might struggle. But I think a lot of those sort of very ADHD, I tell a story or I go off on a tangent or I'm on a side quest. I think we can't stop it completely. I think it's very, very hard. But if we frame it up, I call this a communisplation. So it's communicating and explaining. You don't even have to say I'm ADHD. Like if you're in a workplace and you're like, I can't, just saying I'm a person who's anxious and I need to know where we're going and what we're doing. I'm a person who has some sensory issues. So I don't know that that's the best place for me, but could we go somewhere else? I'll join you next time. This isn't the best thing for me. Or I'm going to tell a story. It's going to be completely unrelated, but I promise you it is related. And when we come back around, you're going to see why I'm telling the story. Those kind of things I think can really help us, because otherwise people write their own story. They think their own stuff, and usually their explanation is not what's happening. And so I know there's some people who say we're always explaining, people should get to know and understand us. But here's the thing, I think everyone's always explaining. I think in life, people, when they have really good communication skills, they explain stuff to you or they give their perspective to you. And that really helps. And so I think, I want the world to come to understand us better. But in the meantime, I think this can really help.
I think so too, because it's context, isn't it? And I sort of talk about it in terms of filling in the gaps. Like people will fill in the gaps themselves. So you can either give them context in whatever way you feel is something you're comfortable with sharing, however you want to frame it. But if we can help them fill in those gaps to tell the real story, it avoids that sense of misunderstanding that you were talking about. And I think it's something I've become acutely aware of as an adult, particularly with all the training that I've been doing with you on this, that actually we do this. We might be out somewhere and we might come across an adult and they might be quite rude to us in a particular context or situation. And we create this story in our head. Well, I do it sometimes. And often I'm at the center of it. Like I feel a rejection or a sense of this person doesn't like me. And actually now I'm really starting to be much more mindful of that perspective of, well, what's going on for that person? Like, what are their social skills? Like, and seeing the big picture. But because I'm just aware that this is something we all do. And if we do it as adults, then young people and children are definitely going to be doing those things. So I think it's a really, really important thing. And I also think it helps to pick up on what we were saying earlier about the difference between why this isn't about masking is because it also celebrates who you are. So we're not saying hide any of this stuff. We're saying like, this is me and this is why and this is who I am and it's out here in all its glory. And we're just sort of celebrating it. And I like to think of flipping this stuff because we talk a lot about struggles and the skills alongside those, but the opposite of all our struggles are these amazing strengths. And I think that there are many incredible ADHD strengths that make us and our children awesome friends to have. So how can we really help them use those strengths and use those interests to find their people, as we said earlier on, and truly connect, like to build the basis and the foundations of friendships?
Well, the first thing I would do is like go and explore what are your child's strengths and then try to think how they can bring it to friendship. Like, your kid may never turn in a homework assignment, right? But their strength might be creativity. Their strength might be that they are fun and that they have a great sense of humor. And, other kids aren't judging us based on whether we turn in homework assignments. They're judging us based on whether we're fun and good companions. So I would be turning to that kid and saying, you are zany, you are fun, you have a great sense of humor. That's something you offer in friendship. I think building them up with their strengths, absolutely essential. So much of their school day is spent on weaknesses. They have to spend time on strengths. And I think we can absolutely show them. I use a lot of media examples with kids too. I'm like, look at this person. They have ADHD and they have tons of friends. And they talk about the struggle and they've learned these skills and now they have an easier time. I also think like just pointing it out in the moment. Like, you're so funny, people will want to be around you, And I also think that one of the biggest things I took away from some research I did for this book was we can use those strengths. If you are super organized, you can be the organizer of social stuff. If you are super empathetic and you feel other people's pain, that is really hard, but it also is a strength because you can become the person who, goes and says to someone, I get that this is really hard for you. And you can have those more intimate conversations. And then people value you for that. You become Claire, who's so empathetic and so there for everybody. And not in a people pleasing way, in a Claire actually notices what is happening for me way, So I think that there's ways that you can take on a role that uses your strengths. And I think part of this is having these discussions. I think friendship becomes such a taboo subject. But I would start from your own perspective and sort of say, as a friend, this is what I try to do. As a friend, I am this person. I am definitely the organizer of my friends. When I was pregnant with my second child, I realized that because we were doing construction in our house, not only did I not see my friends, they did not see each other. And I was like, wait, you didn't see each other because I was in this thing? And they were like, no, because you're the organizer. And I was like, wait, what? So I think like we can take on these roles and we can talk about our own friendship. I think we can talk about how people treat us. I'm not friends with so-and-so anymore because they didn't treat me well and I deserve to be treated well. Like, I think a lot of times as parents, that's something we can give our child, or even forgiveness. I sometimes have people say things to me too, like you said, that person said to you. And, I have to wonder what is going on in their lives, right? Or I sometimes do that. I think it's about me. And that's that's the little girl who was bullied. And I have to check her. I have to say, 14-year-old Caroline is not going to drive this bus. We don't know what's going on. We don't know if this person actually slighted me or if this is, my own rejection. And I'm going to take the road of, until they tell me, it's not about me. Like, I think saying that stuff out loud is also really important in this journey, because I think kids don't always think of us as people, but we can model those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you've never been a teenager. You couldn't possibly understand.
Well, because we're so ancient, Claire. It was like the 70s and 80s. When was that?
So old. And I love that your example there about 14-year-old Caroline, because I think that's really important as well, because given that ADHD is so highly genetic, like I have ADHD, I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult because of my journey with my son. And there'll be so many people listening to this who they themselves are neurodivergent and perhaps have struggled with friendships as children and maybe even into adulthood as well. And they're listening to this and aware of those kind of your example, 14-year-old Caroline, all of those things that sit under the surface and that can be so easily triggered for all of us. But how do we then, as adults listening to this, how can we start this process for ourselves too, if we're listening thinking, do you know what, maybe this is something I could do with some help with?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to do, and I'm sorry, it always comes down to us as parents, it's like so annoying. We can start by thinking about what we can model better, right? So, maybe you are somebody who doesn't have a lot of friends. Kids are so sensitive to hypocrisy. So if you haven't taken a friendship journey, take one, right? Because they will love that. They'll be like, you're doing it too. I think we can also, be willing to work on our skills. And I think we can talk about friendship from not a lecturing standpoint, but a collaborative one.
Yeah, absolutely. And to use this opportunity as well to say that in addition to your amazing Why Will No One Play With Me book, which is about children and helping them develop socially, that your new book that you've mentioned and touched on, that's specifically for adults, isn't it? Neurodivergent adults. And that comes out in spring next year.
Yes. And it will be like April 16th in the UK. So it will be April 16th for Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults. And it's for adults with anxiety, autism, ADHD, learning disabilities. And because I know neurodivergence is quite a broad term, but that's how I define it. And I'm not trying to leave anyone out. I'm just not qualified to work with certain folks. And so I wouldn't exit my lane in that way. But I think, even if someone is shy, even if someone isn't diagnosed, they can use the strategies. And I think it's important for us as adults also to, as we're working with our kids, remember this is hard. I mean, there's literally, the Surgeon General of the United States came out and said that we are having like worldwide epidemic loneliness. Friendship is hard as an adult. And so we know it's hard for kids and teens. I think there's a lot of backdraft from the pandemic that we really, as parents, didn't anticipate maybe, but it is there. So, if your teenager or your kid spent 2-3 years at home, they miss stuff. And so I think just to be more empathetic, to know that they're trying, and to understand a lot of this, it feels like, why won't you do this? But really it's about, I don't know the skills and my executive function is weak and I'm not really sure how to do this.
And that book will help them, as you said, as an adult, as a parent, model and start taking their own steps on a friendship journey. So before you go, Caroline, what one final piece of advice would you like to leave parents listening whose children struggle socially to help them feel less alone?
Give them a place where they feel really good about themselves, and also where, their people are. And I would just say, I know it's work, it's time, it's money, but if you have to drive to a different town, if you have to search around to find the right team where the coach gets it, I think that has such lasting effects. Look for the places where they can be themselves and where things are more accepted. The theater. I was a theater kid. The theater is a pretty accepting place, and I think just understand that this is a journey, and the less reactive we can be. And I know this is so hard when you're watching your kids struggle, but the less reactive you can be, the less you jump on them. And I make tons of videos about this on Instagram. It's so hard, but the less you do, the more you're able to come from that calm place and be a problem solver with them. Because they also, when you're I just had a client say to me this week, I said, have you told your mom all these great things that you're doing? Like, have you told your parents you did so much great stuff this week? And she said, I don't want to, because then they get so excited and they're like, how about this? How about this? How about that? And we do that as parents, right? We all do it. I've probably done it this week. But the more we can sort of catch ourselves and not do that, because then we stop being as much of a partner. So the more we can be less reactive, the better off your kid will be, because then they're not having to worry about managing us. But I also want to say, I know it's so painful. It's why I wrote a book called Why Will No One Play With Me, right? It is so painful. I've been there myself as a parent. I've been there as a kid. There is such a path forward. The kids can learn these skills, right? I get emails all the time. My kids started Why Will No One Play With Me working with me 7 days ago, and they've already had some wins. So I know that it can happen. And I know that there are moments when you feel so overwhelmed, but it really can get better, and it works. It just takes time.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for ending on that super positive note. It does take time, but it can get better, and we can help our children. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I can't wait till this comes out, and I will share it with everybody.
Thank you, Caroline. If you'd like to learn more about Caroline's work, to buy a copy of Why Will No One Play With Me, or to pre-order her upcoming new book, Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard wherever you're listening today to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.